So picture this, a country completely torn apart by war, now facing the absolutely massive task of putting itself back together. Well, that's the story of Reconstruction. And today, we're going to see exactly how it played out in the heart of the Old South, Georgia. It's 1865. The guns have fallen silent, but the United States is anything but united. The country is just shattered. And the question on everyone's mind was huge. How in the world do you bring the defeated southern states back into the Union? And what's the future for millions of newly freed African Americans? For Georgia, this wasn't some neat and tidy process. It was a chaotic 7-year roller coaster that happened in 3 very, very different stages. This wasn't just about rebuilding bridges and buildings. It was a fight for the very soul of the country. And Georgia was right there on the front lines, getting dragged back into the Union, sometimes kicking and screaming. Okay, so the first shot at rebuilding the South came right from the White House. We call this phase Presidential Reconstruction. After Lincoln was assassinated, President Andrew Johnson stepped in, and his plan was, to put it mildly, surprisingly soft on the South. So what you're seeing here is this fundamental power struggle. On one side, you have President Johnson's plan. Let's do this fast, let's be lenient, let's just get the country back together. But on the other side, in Congress, you had this powerful group called the Radical Republicans, and they were saying, no way. They believed Congress should be in charge, that the South needed to be punished, and, this is crucial, that the federal government had to protect the rights of newly freed Black citizens. This clash of ideas would define the entire era. Now, there was one thing Johnson's plan was absolutely firm on. Every single Southern state had to ratify the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. This was the big one. This was the amendment that officially and forever abolished slavery in the United States. No ifs, ands, or buts. Georgia saw this easy path back and jumped on it. They moved fast. They held a convention, they officially repealed their secession from the Union, and they passed the 13th Amendment. On paper, it looked great, right? Progress. But if you looked a little closer, something was off. The new state constitution they wrote was almost a carbon copy of their old pro-slavery one from 1861. And that set off some serious alarm bells up north. So, believe it or not, by the end of 1865, Georgia had checked the boxes and was officially readmitted to the Union. It all happened incredibly fast. But, as you've probably guessed, this story was far from over. This quiet peace was about to be completely shattered. And that brings us to Phase 2, Congressional Reconstruction. The radical Republicans up in Congress saw what was happening in Georgia, and they were absolutely furious. They felt the president had totally dropped the ball, so they decided to take matters into their own hands and seize control of the whole process. So what's the first thing Georgia does with its shiny new status? In an act of pure defiance, it elects Alexander Stephens, the former vice president of the Confederacy, and Herschel Johnson, a former Confederate senator, to go represent them in the U.S. Senate. I mean, can you just imagine how well that went over in Washington? And as if sending Confederate leaders to Congress wasn't enough of a poke in the eye, Georgia's legislature then passed a series of laws known as Black Codes. These were specifically designed to control the lives and labor of the newly freed African American population. Let's be really clear about what these codes were for. Their goal was to basically recreate slavery, just under a different name. The 13th Amendment had granted freedom on paper, but these laws were a direct attempt to snatch it away in practice, denying basic rights like voting, serving on a jury, or even getting a fair trial. The North just exploded with outrage. The radical Republicans saw this as a total betrayal of everything the war was fought for. And they responded immediately. They simply refused to let Alexander Stephens and Herschel Johnson even take their seats in the Senate. So Georgia was kind of in the Union, but its representatives were locked out. So then, Congress made its big power move. As a direct counterattack to the Black Codes, they passed the 14th Amendment. This was a bombshell. It was specifically written to override those state laws by granting citizenship to anyone born in the U.S. and guaranteeing them equal protection of the laws. Congress drew a new line in the sand. Ratify the 14th Amendment, and then you can have your seats back. And what did Georgia do? Along with most of the South, it said no. Flat out refused. And that act of defiance is what triggered the most drastic phase of Reconstruction yet. The South wouldn't budge, so Congress lowered the boom. Welcome to Phase 3, Military Reconstruction. The federal government was officially done asking nicely. So, the Reconstruction Act of 1867 basically wiped the slate clean. It treated the South like a conquered territory. The old state governments were dissolved. The entire former Confederacy was carved up into 5 military districts. Georgia got lumped in with Alabama and Florida to become the 3rd district, all under the command of a U.S. Army general. Civilian government was out, military rule was in. So, under the watchful eye of the U.S. military, Georgia was forced to start all over again. And this time, things were radically different. The new Constitutional Convention actually included 37 Black delegates for the very first time, and the Constitution they created was way more progressive. It finally granted voting rights to Black men, it set up a public school system, and it even moved the state capital to the growing city of Atlanta. But there was one last hurdle to clear. Congress passed the 15th Amendment, which made it crystal clear that the right to vote could not be denied by any state because of someone's race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Georgia had to ratify this one too. After all that pressure and political chaos, Georgia finally gave in and ratified the 15th Amendment. So in July of 1870, 5 long years after the war had ended, the state was officially and finally back in the Union. For good this time.
But the end of military rule wasn't some happy ending where everyone held hands. It was a really fragile peace, and the old guard, the forces of the Old South, were already plotting their comeback.
This comeback was led by a group of white Southern Democrats who called themselves the Redeemers. Their public goal was to redeem the South from what they called corrupt Republican rule and Northern meddling, but their real goal? To restore the old social hierarchy, white supremacy, as much as they possibly could. And what's just incredible is how fast they did it. Through a mix of political games, racist appeals to white voters, and brutal intimidation of Black voters by groups like the Ku Klux Klan, the Redeemers just swept back into power. By 1872, just 2 years after being readmitted, they'd already retaken the governor's mansion and the entire state legislature. When you look at the 7 years between 1865 and 1872, it's just a whirlwind. Georgia went from a defeated state where slavery was the law to a state with 3 new constitutional amendments that guaranteed freedom and voting rights. But then look at that last line. The period started with Confederate leaders in charge and ended with Redeemer Democrats in charge. It was a different name for a very, very similar agenda. So that leaves us with this huge, lingering question. Sure, Georgia was physically and politically back in the United States, but with the old power structure already back in control and with the rights of Black citizens already under attack, was the fundamental work of remaking the South? Was it even close to being done? That's a question whose answer would echo for the next 100 years.